How much time do you spend in the summer heat carrying individual buckets of water to your olive trees so that they don't shrivel up in the summer heat? Well, none. Those root systems go deep. How much time do you spend out in your olive grove with your rake and hoe chopping down the weeds so that the weeds don't grow up and crowd out the olive trees? Well, none. Do you think the grass growing around the base of the olive trees in the bottom photograph is going to damage the olive trees any? It doesn't bother the olive trees. What do you do during the growing season? Well, you do something very important. Every once in a while, you take a look at the olive trees. When olives ripen, then you start to harvest them. When you have enough harvested to collect, then you put them in a big press. When you have enough collected to make it worthwhile to spend an afternoon making some olive oil, then you put the olives into a press, you squeeze out the oil. Olives off the tree, by the way, have almost nothing to do with olives that you buy in the jar at the grocery store. Olives off the tree are like so full of oil, they're like, you hold one off, the grease starts running down your arm. They've got to be pressed and then dried and lye, believe it or not, to loosen up the fibers. They're inedible without this process. Anyway, you collect the olives, you squeeze out all that oil that they're just soaked in, and then you go back to watching the olive trees. As more olives ripen, you harvest them, and it sends to make some more olive oil some afternoon. You make some more olive oil. And then at the end of the growing season, you load up all your barrels of olive oil on the back of a wagon, take them down to the dock, and hope somebody shows up with a boat from somewhere else with 40 acres of wheat to trade for your olive oil. And what that means is that you've effectively fed a family, a good-sized family, for a year with about 6 weeks of work. It's not too bad. It's not too shabby. You got a side job to bring in some cash for some other things. You've got a pretty nice life, and you've certainly provided food for your family for a year with about 6 weeks of work. Now, grapevines take a little bit more work, but not that much more work. You don't have to plant them every year. Grapevines will produce for decades, if not centuries. You have to get out when it's the coldest part of the year and cut the vines back, and that's not a lot of fun, but you have to do that. But you certainly don't have to irrigate them. I mean, you might carry water to them if it hasn't rained for a couple of weeks, but nothing like beans. You don't have to worry so much about weeds. You know, you might cut back the weeds maybe twice in a growing season just to do it, but they're certainly not going to crowd out your grape harvest. They might improve your harvest a little bit. It might be worth doing it, but certainly nothing like growing beans, that kind of intensive labor. And what this decision means, this decision to rely on these two products in particular, olive oil and wine, is that you have an awful lot of people, not everybody, but an awful lot of people, and a lot more people than you might think. A lot bigger part of the population than you might think. We've got access to something that hardly anybody in the ancient world did have access to, and that's something important to me, and that's leisure time. Time to do all kinds of things. Time maybe to walk through your olive grove and think to yourself, well, I'm fortunate that my grandparents planted these olive trees. I didn't even have to plant them the first time. You know, I wish I knew more about my grandparents. I don't know much about them. I know that my grandfather fought in a war. I don't really know much about that war, but you know, I'll bet somebody in town's written a book about that war. The next time I'm in town, I'm going to stop by the library and check out that book and read it and see if I can learn something about the war that my grandfather fought in. Time to do what you and I think of as history, which is more than just making up stories about the ancestors and that kind of thing, but looking for documents and looking for evidence and looking for argument about why things have happened the way that they have happened, and to learn lessons to see what in the future we can do to avoid certain problems. Time to do history. Time to do all kinds of things. Time maybe to walk over to that stone wall that separates your olive grove from your neighbor's olive grove, and your neighbor's over there, you wave at him, he walks over, and you spend a few minutes talking about the weather, and then you start talking about politics in town. And once you've stopped complaining about all the politicians you don't like and all that kind of stuff, well, then you have a serious conversation about politics. Well, what is our major problem in the city, and how should we best use power to solve the problem? That's the issue of politics. Well, it would be the best form of government, to have a sophisticated conversation about politics. Time to do all kinds of things. Maybe time to come back from a shopping trip into town and say, you know, our favorite playwright wrote a new play this weekend, or it's being produced this weekend at the theater in town. Maybe this weekend we'll go into town and watch a play in the theater. Time to do all kinds of things. Time to just think about things. Time maybe just to sit next to your mountain stream and pick up a stone and throw that stone in the water and watch it sink to the bottom and think to yourself, and then reach over and pick up a stick and throw the stick in the water and watch it float downstream and think to yourself, I wonder why. Why does wood float in water and rocks sink in water? I wonder why. Oh, rocks are heavier than wood. Duh, I guess I figured that one out pretty fast. But wait a second, no, that doesn't make sense. Because you can take a little rock that weighs nothing. You can take a grain of sand, a little rock that weighs nothing, and you throw it in the water, it sinks down to the bottom. But now I've been down to the docks, and I've seen ships made out of wood that must weigh 10 or 20 tons. And they go floating across the water just fine. And last time I was at a lake, I saw a tree log floating out there. It must have weighed, 300 pounds. And it floats just fine, but I pick up this little rock that weighs nothing, and it sinks down to the bottom. What about rocks make them sink in water and wood float in water? I don't know, but next time I'm in town, I'm going to stop by where the scientists hang out, and I'm going to ask, because I'd just like to know. I'm sure one of them has a theory to explain why things happen the way that I see them happening. Time to do what you and I think of as science. Time to do all kinds of things. Some of it might be important to you. Well, one of our best sources of information about ancient Greek culture comes to us from a writer named Homer. According to tradition, Homer is a blind man who makes his living by going from town to town, reciting very long poems, charging money to tell people these very long stories. Two books attributed to Homer, which are best sources of information about ancient Greek society. The first of these books, a book called the Iliad. The Iliad is the story of a war between the city of Troy and all the other Greek cities, called the Trojan War. It's a famous war. The ancient Greeks made reference to this war often in their culture, and here we have a good example in Homer's Iliad. The war with Troy is a very long war. Just to make things short, somebody in Troy does something that ticks off all the other Greek cities, and all the Greek cities go to war with Troy. It's a very long war. I think it takes 14 years to sort itself out. The most famous part of the Trojan War is right at the end of the war. The Trojans wake up one morning, look out over the city walls, and it looks like the Greeks have gone home, and they're left behind a big wooden horse. And the Greeks say, hey, free horse, let's bring the horse inside the city gates. You've heard the story before, right? It's a very famous story, the Trojan horse story. So you know the horse isn't empty. It has a squad of Greek soldiers inside it. When night falls, those soldiers leave the horse. They make their way to the city gates, open up the gates. As it turns out, the Greek soldiers didn't go home, and they come inside and kill everybody, which pretty much ends the war. Homer's Iliad tells a story of only about a week and a half out of that very long war. It focuses on a very narrow section and tells that story. The other book attributed to Homer, a book called the Odyssey. The Odyssey tells the story of a journey home from the war. The story of an officer and his men. That officer has two different names depending on which manuscript tradition you're looking at. In some manuscripts he's called Ulysses, and some he's called Odysseus. The stories are the same, it's just some minor changes, and the most significant, the name of the lead character, Ulysses or Odysseus. Ulysses and his men make their way back home. And if you thought the war was long, getting home takes even longer. I think it takes Ulysses 21 years to get home. Of course, he spends 7 years on an island with a nymph, so apparently he's not anxious to get home. He has all kinds of adventures. You know how these stories work. He goes to the place where the dead people live, and he goes to the place where the Cyclops live. These are big, scary monsters with one eye in the middle of their forehead who eat people. He goes to one island where his men get turned into pigs for somehow, so now he's got to sort out and figure out how to get his men back to being human beings. All kinds of crazy stuff happens to him. Finally, he makes it home where his dog's waiting for him on the front porch. His dog, who by now was 147 in dog years at least, sees Ulysses walking up the steps. He jumps up and gives a bark of welcome and then drops dead of a heart attack. But he was a good dog, you see. He was a good dog. He wouldn't die until his buddy got home, you see. And so all this crazy stuff happens. You end up with a sappy dog story at the end. But along the way, there's an awful lot to talk about. And I would hope that at some point you would have a literature teacher who would talk to you about issues and values that you would find in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Values like dignity and integrity and honor and courage and loyalty and and these kinds of big fancy words, and to think about what it means to live out a life which is full of these kind of values. For us in this course, we're more interested in what Homer's Iliad and Odyssey teaches about ancient Greek society. And one of the first things we learn about ancient Greek society is that, there really is no such thing as ancient Greek culture or ancient Greek society. There's really no such thing. I mean, there's a map where there's a place that we call Greece, a place on the map that we call Greece, where people live who we call the Greek people, who speak the Greek language, who tell stories about the Greek gods, and so on. But there's no one unified Greek culture. Instead, every city in ancient Greece has its own culture. Every city has its own way of life. Every city, or the Greek word for city, the polis. Every Greek city has its own way of life, has its own style of clothing, has its own laws, has its own rulers, has its own favorite food recipes, has its own favorite plays to perform, has its own favorite songs to sing. Every Greek city has its own way of life. In ancient Greece, the city is important. The city tells you who you are. The city gives you your identity. The city tells everybody else who you are. In ancient Greece, the first thing you want to know about somebody is what city they come from, because immediately you know an awful lot about that person. We're going to be taking a look at two ancient cities in ancient Greece, two major polis. And the first city to talk about that comes out of ancient Greece, the city of Sparta. The real city of Sparta, not the Sparta in the movie The 300. Although maybe after we talk about Sparta, you'll see why they put that kind of comic book movie and set it in Sparta, because it does kind of fit. Well, fairly early in its story, Sparta sets off on a plan of conquest. It picks fights with the other cities around it, the territory around the city of Sparta, until eventually the Spartans will come to control a huge amount of territory and a very large population, about half of ancient Greece, what we think of in terms of both the territory and the population, are under Spartan control. And as it turns out, the Spartans aren't very nice to the people they conquer. They make them their slaves. Until one day the Spartans wake up and realize they have a problem. From their perspective, at least, they have a problem. And that is that 90% of their population are slaves. Only 10% are Spartan citizens, free persons of Sparta. Only 10% are Spartans. The rest are slaves. Well, what are the 10% going to do to keep down the 90%? What if 90% of the population don't want to be slaves anymore and rebel? What's the 10% going to do to control the 90%? Well, from their perspective, at least, they got a problem. Well, to solve their problem, at least from their perspective, it's a problem. The Spartans make an interesting decision. And in order to keep their slaves, they give up their own freedom. And Sparta becomes what you and I would think of as a heavily militarized society, where everything in Sparta, as far as the Spartan citizens are concerned, as far as the Spartans are concerned, every life revolves around the army. Because every Spartan citizen, every free person of Sparta, every Spartan is a soldier. Every Spartan is a soldier. Male or female, young or old, every Spartan is a soldier. From the moment you're born, you're in the army. Literally from the moment you're born. From the moment you're delivered from your mother's body, a board of officers shows up and gives you your military induction exam, your physical exam. And if you're healthy for a newborn baby, well, then you're enlisted in the army. But if maybe you came in a little bit early and you have a little catch in your chest, and you don't quite have the breathing thing down the way it should be, or maybe you come in a little bit on the small side, or maybe one of the officers reaches over and gives you a pinch and you give a whiny little cry instead of a full-throated Spartan kind of cry, well, you fail the physical exam. And although you may be only a few seconds old, you learn the first lesson of life in Sparta, and that is that Spartans do not tolerate failure. And you fail the physical exam, the officers will take the baby, throw the baby over the city walls, and let the animals take care of the baby. Because I said, in Sparta, every Spartan is in the army. And if you're not good enough to be in the army, then you're not good enough to be a Spartan, and you're not worth digging a hole for. If you survived your physical exam, then you're in the army. As soon as you're weaned from your mother's body, you no longer need your mother's milk for nutrition, then you're taken to live in the barracks, where you'll live for most of the rest of your life. You would know who your mother and father were as you grew up. You'd go and visit your father in his barracks. You'd go and visit your mother in her barracks. They'd be proud of you. You'd be proud of them. But the person you had that parental connection to, the person who has that connection of having raised you day by day, would be your platoon sergeant. The young man for the little boy soldiers in the little boy barracks, the young woman for the little girls soldiers in the little girl barracks, who's been given the job of raising you until you're old enough to get your own platoon. You would know who your brothers and sisters were. You'd go and visit your brothers in your brothers' barracks. You'd go and visit your sisters in your sisters' barracks. You'd cheer for them in athletic competitions and so on. But the people you had that brother-sister connection to, that connection of growing up with day by day as you grow up, that would be the soldiers in your platoon. The platoons open up on what are called age cohorts. So as babies born, they're enlisted in one platoon. When that platoon is full, you open up the next one. And so all the soldiers in the platoon are about the same age. Children are taught to march in formation while they learn how to walk. In fact, they're taught to crawl in formation while they learn how to crawl. Children are intentionally fed fewer calories than they need to eat to survive, so they're always a little bit hungry. But a Spartan kid learns pretty fast that hunger is something that can be compartmentalized and dealt with. You can set that aside and focus on the task at hand. Hunger is an almost constant companion for a little Spartan kid. They're almost always hungry, and they learn pretty quickly that you can be hungry and function just fine. You can put that hunger out of your mind and focus on the task at hand, whether it's the algebra exam, whether it's the physical exercise, or whatever. And they also learn very quickly how to sneak into places and steal food and not get caught. How to sneak into the slaves' houses in the city and steal food. How to sneak into the kitchens in the barracks and steal food and not get caught, because there's a stiff penalty for getting caught stealing food. On your seventh birthday now, a platoon sergeant puts you in a burlap bag, ties the bag shut so you can't see where you're going, puts you on the back of a horse, and takes you a 3-day walk from Sparta. Opens up the bag, lets you out, and says, "Happy birthday, kid. Report back to me in Sparta in 3 days," and goes riding off. 7-year-old kid now. Has to first of all figure out where he or she is. Has to remember all those stupid maps he had to learn so he can figure out how to get back home. Has to cross hostile territory to get back home, where 90% of the people who live there wouldn't mind offing a little Spartan kid, one less to grow up and boss him around when he grows up. Kid has to protect himself or herself from wild animals. In 3 days, it'd be nice to find food, but this kid's gone 3 days without food before. That's the least on his list, is I need some food. He's gone 3 days without food. But 3 days without water is pushing the envelope. He's got to remember his training. What kind of water can you drink? What kind of water can't you drink? And he's got to make it back home in 3 days, because he knows what happens. He knows what to do if day 4 comes and he's still on the road, and that is to keep walking. Go make a life for yourself somewhere else. The last thing you want to do is show up on the 4th day with a list of excuses about how you didn't report in on the 3rd day. In fact, this kid's probably seen an older kid who tried it, and he knows what happened to him. And he knows not to show up in Sparta on the 4th day with, "Well, I was going to make it yesterday, but then I ran into a bunch of problems." Spartans don't tolerate failure. Well, in a world history course, we could go on and say some more about the Spartans and Spartan way of life and all kinds of things to think about. How does marriage work when married couples live in separate barracks, and all kinds of stuff to think about and talk about. But I think that's enough for you to see that Sparta has its own unique way of life. The city tells you who you are. If you're a Spartan, it tells you that you're a soldier. And the first thing you want to know about somebody when you meet them is what city they come from, because immediately you know an awful lot about that person. If you meet a young woman and she says, "My name is Susan and I'm from Sparta," then you know something about Susan. She can kick your butt, for one thing. If she's older than 7, she's tough. You automatically know something about somebody. The second big city out of ancient Greece to talk about is ancient Athens. So far in the course, we've been moving pretty quickly, but now is the time to put on the brakes and take a good hard look at one part of the ancient world that's played a major role in shaping your lives, and that is ancient Athens.